A man entered and asked if the aisle that trades had accepted his offer. The question hung in the air longer than it should have, as though the store needed time to decide whether it had heard him. I stood behind the register, hands resting on a surface that never seemed to gather dust. The overhead lights hummed faintly, steady but not quite uniform. One flickered at intervals too irregular to be faulty, too deliberate to ignore. Beyond the counter, aisles stretched in rigid lines, labels printed in neat, unhelpful fonts. Lost items, unclaimed hours, borrowed names. None of them were ever stocked the same way twice. The man didn't step further inside. He lingered just past the threshold, as if crossing fully might cost him something extra. I asked, he repeated, quieter this time, if the aisle that trades has accepted my offer. Customers rarely spoke that way. They usually wandered in confused, drawn by something they couldn't name, and left with less than they realized. This one had come with intention. Worse, he expected an answer. I can check, I said, though I didn't move. The store disliked urgency, preferred acknowledgement first. A faint shift passed through the aisles. Not movement exactly, more like attention being redirected. The labels along the shelves adjusted their alignment by a fraction, as though straightening themselves under scrutiny. The man exhaled shakily. I left it 3 nights ago. Same place as before. Offers aren't always processed immediately, I said. It was something I'd learned to say early to set expectations. The store did not operate on time as people understood it. He took a step forward. The automatic doors behind him did not close. They said it would be different this time, he murmured. That if I gave enough, it would notice. The word notice seemed to settle heavily into the space. I finally stepped out from behind the counter. The floor felt subtly uneven beneath my shoes, as if shifting to accommodate a path. I gestured down the central aisle. It's this way. He followed, though not closely. There was a careful distance he maintained, like someone trailing behind a guide they didn't entirely trust. We passed expired conversations, where sealed jars lined the shelves, each containing a faint, flickering murmur. Then misplaced intentions, mostly empty except for a single object that pulsed faintly under opaque wrapping. The air grew cooler as we moved deeper. Aisle that trades doesn't always stay in one place, I said. You remember that, don't you? He nodded quickly. I found it. I always find it. There was something unsettling in that certainty. We turned a corner that hadn't been there moments ago. The shelves here were taller, stretching up into a dimness the lights didn't quite reach. The labels were absent, replaced by blank strips that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the glow above. At the end of the aisle, a narrow opening yawned between 2 shelves. The man stopped walking. That's not where I left it, he said. It's where it is now, I replied. He hesitated, then moved forward, drawn more by necessity than trust. I watched as he stepped into the gap. For a moment, the lighting shifted, flattened, until his outline seemed pressed thin against the space, like a reflection struggling to exist without a surface. Then he was through. I followed. The aisle that trades never resembled the rest of the store. Felt older. The shelves here were mismatched, unevenly spaced, some leaning inward as though listening. Objects sat on them without labels, without price markers, without any indication of what they were or had been. At the center, on a low pedestal, rested a small, unremarkable box. The man froze when he saw it. That's mine, he whispered. I said nothing. He approached slowly, each step deliberate. His hand trembled as he reached out, then stopped just short of touching the box. It's still closed, he said, voice tightening. Last time it was open. That doesn't mean it hasn't been considered. He swallowed. I gave more this time. The air around us seemed to lean closer. What did you offer? I asked. He laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. Does it matter? It takes what it wants. That's not how it works. His gaze snapped to me. Then how does it work? I looked at the box. It remained perfectly still, its surface dull and featureless, yet impossibly precise, as if every edge had been decided with intent. "It accepts what fits," I said. He stared at me, searching for something more, but I had nothing else to give. Slowly, he lowered his hand onto the lid. The store reacted immediately. A faint vibration ran through the shelves, subtle but unmistakable. Somewhere in the distance, a glass jar cracked. Not shattered, just enough to release a thin thread of sound that drifted and dissolved. The man inhaled sharply. "It's warm," he said. "Then it's been handled." "By what?" I didn't answer. He closed his eyes and lifted the lid. For a moment, nothing happened. Then his expression changed. It wasn't sudden. It unfolded slowly, like recognition dawning in stages. Confusion first, then disbelief, then something heavier. Something that pulled at the corners of his mouth and hollowed his gaze. "No," he said, barely audible. He reached into the box. I couldn't see what he touched. The interior resisted observation, its depth uncertain, its contents obscured not by darkness but by a kind of refusal to be seen. His fingers closed around something. When he pulled his hand back, it was empty. But the change was immediate. He staggered slightly, as though adjusting to a shift in balance that wasn't physical. His shoulders slumped, his posture collapsing inward. The desperation that had driven him here drained away, replaced by something quieter, more permanent. "What did it take?" I asked. He didn't respond. His eyes moved slowly around the aisle, unfocused, searching for something he couldn't name. "I don't," he began, then stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than any answer. He looked down at his hands, turning them over as if expecting to find evidence of what had been removed. There was nothing, no mark, no absence he could point to. But it was gone. "I can't remember," he said finally. The words seemed to settle into the shelves, absorbed without echo. "That's the trade," I said. He nodded faintly, though it was unclear if he understood. After a moment, he stepped back from the pedestal. The box closed on its own, the lid sealing with a soft, final sound. We stood there, neither of us moving. Then, slowly, the aisle began to shift. The shelves leaned away, the space narrowing, guiding us back toward the main store. The pedestal receded, the box dissolving into the arrangement of objects until it was indistinguishable from anything else. The man turned toward the exit without looking at me. He walked unsteadily at first, then with growing certainty, as though following a path he no longer questioned. When we reached the front, the doors were already open. He paused at the threshold. For a moment, I thought he might ask something, try to understand what he had lost, what he had gained. Instead, he stepped outside. The doors closed behind him. The store settled. The lights steadied. The aisles realigned. The faint hum returning to its usual, almost comforting rhythm. I returned to the counter. On its surface, something new had appeared. A small, unmarked slip of paper. I didn't touch it right away. The store didn't like impatience. After a while, I picked it up. There was no writing on it, no indication of origin or purpose. But as I held it, I felt something subtle shift, like a word on the edge of memory, just out of reach. I tried to recall what I had been thinking before. There was a gap. Not large, not obvious, but present. The slip of paper warmed slightly in my hand. From somewhere deep in the store, a shelf adjusted. Something had been accepted. The store's receipt printer listed items I hadn't sold, but remembered buying. The paper curled over the serrated edge, inching forward with a soft, persistent whir. I stood there longer than I should have, one hand resting on the counter, watching the receipt lengthen as if it were thinking its way into existence. No customers stood in front of me. The automatic doors were closed, their glass reflecting rows of dim aisles and the faint flicker of fluorescent lights that never fully settled. Outside, the street was empty, the kind of empty that felt placed rather than natural, like a backdrop waiting for movement that never came. The printer stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the sound. I reached up and tore the receipt free. It was longer than any purchase should have been. The ink was crisp, the spacing precise. At the top, the time was stamped incorrectly. Minutes that hadn't passed yet. Seconds that seemed to repeat. Below that, the items. Milk 1L. Bread white. Eggs 12. Ordinary things. Things we sold every day. But I hadn't rung them up. I glanced toward the aisles, half expecting someone to step out, to claim the purchase, to explain the mistake. The store remained still. Even the refrigeration units seemed quieter than usual, their low hum subdued, as if listening. I looked back down. The next line was different. Apology unspoken. My fingers tightened around the paper. That wasn't an item. It wasn't anything that could be scanned or stocked or shelved. And yet the formatting matched perfectly, aligned with everything else, as though it had always belonged. I told myself it was a glitch. The register sometimes lagged. The printer sometimes spat out nonsense when the connection faltered. It was an old system patched together with updates that never quite fit. There were explanations. There were always explanations. I set the receipt on the counter. The printer clicked. Another inch of paper fed through. I didn't remember pressing anything. The machine worked in silence now. The were gone. The movement almost imperceptible. The paper advanced as if pulled rather than pushed. I didn't touch it this time. I just watched. New lines appeared. Phone call, missed. Return trip, canceled. The air in the store felt different. Not colder, not warmer. Just denser, like something had settled into it. I became aware of the cameras in the corners. Small, dark domes angled down at the aisles, at the counter, at me. They had always been there, but now they felt attentive. I picked up the receipt again. The ink was still fresh. It smudged slightly under my thumb, though the rest of it remained perfectly intact. "I didn't sell this," I said aloud, my voice sounding too loud in the empty space. The store did not respond. The printer clicked again. A single new line. Visit avoided. I swallowed. There are moments when memory doesn't return all at once, but leaks in through the edges, subtle and unwelcome. A feeling first, then an image that doesn't quite resolve, then a certainty that something has been deliberately set aside. I folded the receipt once, then again, as if reducing its size might reduce its meaning. The bell above the door did not ring, but I found myself looking toward it anyway. The glass reflected me back. Pale under the lights, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes fixed on something just out of frame. Behind my reflection, the aisles seemed longer than before. I turned. They weren't. But the spacing felt off, the distance between shelves stretched by a margin too small to measure, too consistent to ignore. I stepped away from the counter. The floor tiles clicked softly under my shoes, each step echoing a fraction longer than it should have. I moved down the nearest aisle, past neatly arranged rows of canned goods, labels facing forward with an unnatural precision. Everything was in place. Everything was accounted for. And yet the receipt in my hand said otherwise. I stopped halfway down the aisle. There, on the shelf at eye level, sat a carton of milk. The same brand as the one listed. I reached out, hesitated, then pulled it free. Cold. Solid. Real. I turned it over. The expiration date was wrong. Not past, not future, just unfamiliar. A sequence of numbers that didn't align with any system I recognized, as though time had been formatted differently for it. I put it back. The shelf accepted it without resistance, the spacing adjusting instantly to accommodate its return. When I turned back toward the counter, the distance seemed longer than before. The printer was still. For a moment, I thought it had stopped. Then it moved again. Another line. Memory. Deferred. The word deferred lingered in my mind. Not erased. Not lost. Just delayed. I walked back slowly. The receipt had grown longer, trailing down the side of the counter, brushing lightly against the floor. I followed it with my eyes, tracing the list of items, each one precise, each one undeniable in its presence despite my lack of involvement. Near the bottom, the entries became less tangible. Silence. Maintained. Door. closed. I felt something tighten in my chest. There are things you choose not to think about. Not because you've forgotten, but because remembering them requires a kind of acknowledgement you're not prepared to give. The printer paused. Then, with a final, deliberate motion, it printed one more line. The machine fell silent. I didn't reach for the paper immediately. I knew somehow that this last entry was different, that it wasn't just a record, but a conclusion. The store waited. The lights hummed softly overhead. The refrigerators exhaled a slow, steady breath. The cameras remained fixed, unblinking. I lifted the receipt. My eyes moved down the list, past the items I hadn't sold, past the ones I hadn't wanted to recognize, until they reached the final line. For a moment, I couldn't process it. The words were simple, clear, printed with the same mechanical certainty as everything else. Presence. Returned. The meaning settled slowly. Not something I had bought. Not something I had sold. Something that had come back. I looked up. The reflection in the glass door stood where it should have been. But behind it, just slightly offset, just enough to notice, there was a second shape. Still, patient, waiting for the receipt to finish.